Very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We want to take the opportunity to welcome you to another edition of Let's Talk. Let's Talk is a program discussing issues impacting church members and the wider community, but issues which are not often discussed in a public forum. We are happy to be able to share and to discuss. And today we continue that very intriguing discussion we started last week with our special guest, Dr. Patterson. We're going to be introducing him in a while, but before we do so, we want to invite you to have a word of prayer with us, shall we? Almighty Father and our God, we thank you for the opportunity to come today on another edition of Let's Talk. We pray that you will be with us as we share, be with our guests in a very special way. Grant that the information we present today will prove meaningful. In Jesus' name, amen. So as indicated earlier, we have with us again Dr. Patterson. He is Professor Emeritus in Leadership at the Theological Seminary at Andrews University, where he lectured for a number of years after having a distinguished career in pastoral ministry and administrative responsibilities. We are delighted to have Dr. Patterson back with us. Doc, good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
We had a very intriguing discussion. Last week, we were talking about the matter of power and authority in the Seventh-day Adventist Church system. Last week, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the operations at the local church level. I want to begin today by asking you to, we have been discussing the matter of power and authority, and it might be a good idea if we can spend a few moments talking about the terms power and authority. How are they different? How are they similar?
Well, thank you. It's a very important question because I know not how it's interpreted in the Caribbean basin, in our English-speaking islands and what have you. But in North America, there's a tendency to treat power and authority as synonyms. It's very important that we understand that they do not mean the same thing. They're related to one another, but they're not synonyms. And so I thought maybe take just a moment to unpack some of the simple definition. Power is the ability to do something. For instance, I have a credential from the General Conference that gives me the right to the responsibilities and privileges of an ordained minister. And so in the context of that, I sometimes am asked to perform weddings. And there's a awkward thing that has arisen because of the COVID virus and what have you, is that the credentials that are usually sent out from the General Conference after a General Conference session, my credential expired on December the 31st of 2020. So if somebody asked me to perform a wedding, I would say to them, I have the power to do it. I have the power to do it because I've done it before. But then let's move over to the word authority. I have the power to perform a wedding, but I do not have the authority to perform a wedding without having that card that declares that I'm certified by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. So power and authority have that unique difference. Power is the ability to do something. Authority is the permission to do it. And if you don't have the permission and you do it anyway, it puts you in the category of an autocrat. In other words, assuming authority that has not been granted to you. And this is we're living in a period in history where we're having the most unexpected war in Europe that arises from the fact that they have a person who has power, but does not have any connection with any group that would limit their authority. And therefore, we moved into a war at the will of one person. Now, assuming authority that we don't own is a high temptation even within the church. And so it behooves us to know what are the limits of my authority. And my authority is limited by time. In other words, between sessions, I'm authorized by the General Conference. It's limited by time, but it is also limited by scope. My credential comes from the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventist, so I have authority at Andrews University. But if I went down to Southern Caribbean University, I believe you have a Southern Caribbean University. If I went to that university and exercised authority because I have authority at Andrews University, I would be out of order because I do not have the permission to exercise authority or power in the context of another institution. So we just need to be very clear personally on what our scope and what our time limitations are in terms of power and authority.
But that's a very insightful clarification that you have made there. And as I listen to the illustration that you use, coming down, you have the authority at Andrews University, but coming down to, well, it's the Southern Caribbean University. I mean, Northern Caribbean universities in Jamaica, but in our union, which is the Caribbean Union, we have what we call the University of the Southern Caribbean. Yeah, so if you come to USC and function without permission, and then you are not functioning under authority. I think that was an excellent illustration that you used there. But could we put this in the context of the church now, where, let's say, a pastor or even an administrator, without the necessary sanctioning, because we discuss, we're going to come to administrators of the conferences in just a few minutes, but because we were talking about the local church last week, a pastor who makes a decision outside of the board and does his own thing, then he may have the power, but he doesn't have the authority, and he becomes autocratic in his. That's
absolutely true. Absolutely true. And yeah, we need to also be constantly aware that the assumption of authority that we don't own is what started the great controversy. And it's very sneaky. It can begin to happen to the best of us. And I know when I was in conference administration, there were moments in time when it was rushed and hurried, and I made decisions that should have been made by the group. And my conscience would correct me in that, but it's very easy to justify assuming authority that we don't own.
Indeed. So we want to talk about those matters and more today, but let's begin with the local church, right where we left off last week, and its relationship to the larger organization. So last week we focused on the local church. Today, I just want to begin by looking at continue by looking at the relationship of the local congregation to the larger organization. There is sometimes the tension of local focus versus organizational goals. How should the local congregation relate to the larger organization, to the conference and the union, etc.?
It's a great question. The years that I spent in conference administration, about 10 years, I came to realize that it's very common for a conference to function without a clear statement of mission. Because if you don't have a clear statement of mission, how then does a church responsibly honor the conference by building their local church mission around an expression of the mission of the conference or the union. So it is the proper thing to do for a local church is to clarify what is the vision of our conference, and then how can we craft a vision that honors our conference as well as our local church. And that in the best of context, that is the right way to approach it, where it's not mandated, but it is simply embraced. The mission of the conference is embraced by the local church to honor those who have put forth a vision for all the people in a particular conference or union.
Mhm. Okay, interesting.
Let me add one other thing.
Yes.
Several years ago, I was involved in ministering and teaching in South Africa. And after a conversation with a layperson who was on a committee that was opposing an action of the union, the South African Union, I received what we would call a subpoena here, but I received a subpoena from the South African state to appear at a hearing, for the plaintiff, which put me in a very interesting situation, because my paycheck comes from the General Conference, and they were the ones who were providing the attorneys and challenging the behavior of that local union. And so I declined, even though I was in sympathy with the lay people issue that they were facing. I declined on the basis that it was a conflict of interest for me to do that. So there's a lot of nuances that come into our loyalty to and our respect for and extending proper authority to our conference or mission.
I'm tempted to ask you a follow-up question on that, but I'm going to hold it for a little while later, because I if I go there, we might get stuck there, and I do want to cover some other areas. So I hope we do have the time to come back to that, because it's an interesting scenario that you're raising there. But let's resist the temptation and go here now. We want to look at authority and how it functions at the level of the conference. We have officers, we have directors, we have office staff. What is the role of the administration versus the role of the executive committee at the conference level?
Okay. The executive committee in most fields is made up of a balanced membership of the executive committee, a balanced membership of lay people and clergy. That balance allows for the input of the delegates who represent the local churches. And so I think that's one area that we need to be clear on in a representative system, and that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is clearly a representative system. Administrators need to be very careful that they honor the fact that the lay people on the committee are authorized by the constitution of the union or conference. They're authorized to exercise authority in that context. For instance, an interesting event at the General Conference office some years ago, where the president of the General Conference threatened discipline on members of the executive committee for certain issues. And I remember when it happened, because I at that time I was teaching regularly full time at that time, but it shocked me, because the reality is, in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, conference leaders are subordinate to the collective will of the executive committee.
Mhm.
And the executive committee has the authority to discipline or to give counsel to administrators, because the administrators do not possess the kind of the power that overrides an executive committee. The executive committee, I'm sorry, let me first mention executive or the denominational leaders. Leaders in the Seventh-day Adventist Church make recommendations to the executive committee, but they do not make the decisions themselves. So if you come to an executive session, you come to a session of the executive committee, administrators should bring before the committee recommendations, and something as simple as termination of an employee. That is not done by the administrator. It is done by the executive committee. And I had the unfortunate experience many years ago of being a little too critical of my conference leaders, and I was terminated. I did not know it at the time, but I was terminated by my conference president. But it never was presented to the executive committee at all. And so it's very easy for us in a world that is controlled by manage-oriented leaders, very easy for the church to slip into that role and grant the authority to leaders to make decisions that God never intended leaders in the church should make. Am I making myself clear?
Most definitely. In fact, I'm going to, I know we said this several times last week, but just in case somebody missed it, because people assume, I think the average member, perhaps maybe because they don't take time to reflect on how the church functions, or sometimes just pure a lack of knowledge, don't understand that a conference president does not fire and does not employ. I hear all the time, oh, the administration is wicked, or the administration is this way or that way, because look at what they have done. So again, we function on this principle. We said it several times last week, that the decisions are always made by committees, not by individuals. And you're making a very important point, that the administration may carry recommendations to the executive committee, but it is not the administration that makes the decision.
That's correct.
Yeah, and sometimes, isn't it also true that sometimes the administration carries a recommendation and the executive committee takes that decision and turns it upside down and does something else?
That can happen, and we need to be man or woman enough that we accept the fact that the executive committee has made a decision different from what we have recommended, and that takes character. Takes character to do that, because as a leader we can feel diminished by that. I remember being invited to speak at a convention of the Inter-American Division on the subject of terminal authority, and it created some stress because we don't openly talk about the fact that leaders make recommendations but not decisions. And I noticed very interesting, some of the lay people who were at that meeting, because the executive committees were invited from across the division, became vocal in the context of that presentation, became vocal about the issue of rubber stamping, issues that were brought before the committee. The committee was expected to just put a stamp on it and just move on quickly. And so it turned out to be a very interesting meeting, because I did not intend to raise emotions. The emotions were aroused at that meeting because many of the executive committee members felt that they were being treated as though they did not have authority.
Very, very interesting. You know, Doc, as we are talking about the the matter of who makes the decision at the conference level, at the union level, at the general conference level, let's for a moment talk about the president. What kind of power does the president have? Does the president have kingly power? Can the president say, listen, I'm the president here, this is the direction I want to go in, you have to come with me?
Never. I do not believe that the president ever has that authority. You know, the interesting thing in the Seventh-day Adventist system, if you study the history of organization in our church, it was culminated in a very healthy leadership model in 1901 at the General Conference session. That was the key session where the Seventh-day Adventist model was created. And it's very clear in that model that the authority of leaders was to be limited. That was inconsistent with the history that was going on around them. In the late Industrial Revolution, you had people like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and Thomas Edison and others who were great industrial people, wealthy people. But they led without any concern about the people who did the work to create what happened. And so you had a lot of cruelties that arose during that period of time. And that was repeated in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the early 1900s, where Ellen White was in Australia. She wrote a letter and said, gentlemen, it has been 2 years since I've been able to pay my staff. And she said, I don't even have enough money to pay the groceries. Now this is very practical stuff. And Ellen White was in that situation, and the church was not following through on their obligation. And she was told, for instance, that the Great Controversy manuscript that she wanted to renew that about 1888. And they said they didn't have the money to do it. So she went to a bank and borrowed $25,000 in 1898, I believe it was. A lot of money. Sent it to the General Conference. And the General Conference leaders, there were 3 of them, used it for something else. They used it for something else. Now this is Seventh-day Adventist leaders doing that to the very lady who was key in the development of our church. And so there was this authority by position that emerged in the Seventh-day Adventist Church after 1901 that did not paint a very pleasant picture of leadership in the church. It was all based on the fact that they were assuming authority based on the model of the Industrial Revolution, not on the model that God had given the church.
Interesting. Now we do have a system, I want to think, that counters that. We have 3 administrators, president, secretary, and treasurer. And my understanding is that these 3 administrators are supposed to work in unison. It is not a triangular structure where the president is the, how do we call this now? He's first among equals, so to speak. Now, he does chair the executive committee, and he's the president, but it should not be a system where the president determines. I want to think that the ideal situation is to try to seek consensus before one goes to the executive committee.
Yes, and the president is referred to in our system in various places as a first among equals. And so the treasurer and the secretary of a conference or a union or division they are not under the direct authority of their president because they are elected officials. So we have moved toward a secular model and allowed treasurers and secretaries to become subordinate to a president, which is not intended in the system that we have created.
Very well.
So the president has risen up the presidential model, and much of it is based on the changes in the presidency of the United States government. That's part of the pattern that has followed, is that we have allowed ourselves to borrow from another model, and that presidential model of American politics has definitely had a major role in changing the intent of authority in the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Now we have a system that is representative, which allows, let's say, the local church, they send delegates to a conference session, conferences send delegates to a union session, etc. And our constitutions are specifically designed to ensure that there is a significant percentage of laypersons who represent these various levels at the organization. So we do have some built-in mechanisms to function in a way to bring back what we should have. But before we talk about the issues relating to positional power, let's look at the union a little bit and its relationship to the conference. The union is of course the next larger level, and the union president is a member of the conference's executive committee. What is the role of the union, and what is the nature of the relationship that should exist between the conference and the union?
Ellen White made an interesting statement when she came back from Australia. Because Australia, while she was there, created the first union. The first union conference was created in Australia while Ellen White was there. And she, in fact, the document that I sent to you the other day has this quote embedded in it. But she said it was necessary to create unions in order to reduce the centralized authority of the General Conference. So she recognized that there was always this tension to move toward self-authority and away from a shared leadership model, such as what we were given in 1901. The union is not, let me just put it in human terms. The union president is not the boss of the conference president. Well, that's sometimes a little hard to understand.
Mm-hmm.
But the union has a constituency. The conference has a constituency. And so the primary authority that directs a president is not the union. It is the people of his own constituency, because they bring him into authority and they take him out of authority.
But you know, I shared that remark a few months ago, perhaps a year or two ago, and the person I was speaking with seemed very surprised and thought I was a rebel. How could I dare say that? But as I understand the structure of the church, as president, I'm responsible to the executive committee. I'm responsible to my constituency. Of course, there is a working relationship. There is one Seventh-day Adventist Church, and there is a working relationship, you know, to the larger levels of the organization. But in terms of who I report to and who I'm directly responsible to, that's the executive committee.
Yeah.
Which go ahead.
We ran into this with the women's ordination issue. So Elder Wilson, when he heard that there was going to be a constituency session in the Columbia Union, Elder Wilson went to the meeting, and he gave a very passionate speech against voting for ordination of women. When the vote was taken, the result of the vote was 80% for women's ordination and 20% against it. Now that is a huge margin.
Mhm.
The Pacific Union decided to do the same thing. So Elder Wilson went to the Pacific Union. He spoke to that session again passionately. He took a vote, and it was exactly the same percentage in the Pacific Union as it was in the Columbia Union. And so this raised a very serious conversation regarding authority, because Elder Wilson felt that he had authority when he went to that conference session, when in reality he did not have authority, he had only influence. And we don't have time this afternoon to break those in pieces. But he had influence, but not authority, because that was a union session, which is terminal authority for the Columbia Union. And so along the way, as history has moved forward, we have forgotten the structure of our church, which puts the executive committee at the top of the totem pole, and the ultimate voice is the voice of the constituency in session.
Now, I did promise that I was going to come back to the statement you made earlier on when we were talking about conflict of interest. And my take on this now is there is this matter of, I like to use this term, organizational loyalty. As an administrator, understanding decisions of the General Conference, to what extent should you encourage your executive committee along the lines of making decisions that are contrary to the decisions of the General Conference in session?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge. But I think the president has a responsibility for counseling either the session, the constituency session, or the executive committee should counsel them when they are beginning to take the path that puts them at odds with the administration, with policy. But we need to remember that if the executive committee decides to go down that path, and they've been counseled not to, if they decide to go down that path, they have the authorities to do that, but they will also have to face the consequences of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the key. The president is not powerless. The president has been authorized power within certain limits, but he does not have the authority to negate the decision of the executive committee, even though he may believe that it's out of policy. Because at that point, the constituency of that union or that conference or that mission stands in opposition to the policy of the church, and they have to give an answer for that. But many of the changes that turned out to be good changes were changes that initially challenged the status quo.
I sometimes think of how our church evolves as, cultural changes over the years. There is this wiggle room that sometimes become uncomfortable, and the church does have to learn. Sometimes we have to react to certain things, and in the end, it works out for the good. But I do want to ask you a question here on the previous discussion relating to unions and their roles. I think the pandemic that we're in has taught us that there are very effective ways of doing things that we previously didn't consider. For example, we did a lot of traveling in the past, and in the process, I don't want to say wasted, but consumed a lot of money. We now know that we can have meetings virtually, etc. Is there time, is it time rather, for us to look at the structure of the church again in the light of technology? Perhaps, you know, I know there's a lot of discussions over whether we have 4 levels, we have conferences, we have unions, we have divisions, we have general conference. Of course, constitutionally, it is unions and general conference, but is it time for us to
because the division is not
a constituent level? Yes,
that's
correct.
right. Does not have a constituency.
Yeah. But so my question is, what determines when we look at our structure to see whether there is need for change or not?
Well, if I could have your permission to share a historical narrative, I'll try not to take much time in doing it, but answer it by sharing a narrative. In 1873, in Battle Creek, Michigan, James White, who is the former General Conference president, and George Butler, the president, current president, and 2 other men, I forget who they were, got into a conversation that turned into an argument that became so passionate and troublesome that James White suffered a stroke and fell on the floor, and they thought he was dead. They put him in a wagon and took him to his home, turned him over to Ellen. They determined that he did have a heartbeat. He was still alive. But Ellen White said to James, if we don't get you out of Battle Creek is going to kill you. That's a pretty strong statement. But the stress that he was experiencing. So anyway, Ellen took him to somebody's home in a nearby village so that she could block access to him while he was healing. The next morning, George Butler and his 2 friends went looking for him and found him at this house. And went in and apologized for the day before, but then immediately went back into the discussion. And Ellen White had to usher them out of the house. And George Butler, who was a good man, had been very loyal to the Whites and what have you. He felt compelled to write an essay. It was about 30 pages long, and it was entitled Leadership. And in this essay, he put forth the premise that James White should be considered the apostle, God's apostle to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that it would be James White who would be presented with the upcoming decision, and James White would make a decision on whether or not it should be accepted. And once he made a decision about whether it should be accepted or not, you could not change it. So he had ultimate authority to make the final voice on any major change in the church. Now George Butler went around preaching this at camp meetings and what have you through the next year. Ellen White became aware of it. She was in Colorado convalescing James. She read it over and she said, "This is papist." And then James joined her in opposing it. And in the next General Conference session, they had a General Conference session in 1874, and they actually accepted this model 100%. What do you call it? Everybody in the conference committee accepted that change. And so now you have a person who is like a pope in the Seventh-day Adventist Church has been voted unanimously by the General Conference Committee. And now Ellen White's opposing it. And so they took it back to the next General Conference session, and it was rescinded and done away with. But now the amazing thing is that in about 10 years, from the time they began organizing the church until this essay was written, it took only about 10 years before the church that had opposed organization of any kind now wrapped its arms completely around this proposal that makes James White the apostle of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So that shows how tenuous our hold is on the model of representative leadership. And I will tell you, it's under attack even yet today.
Well, that's a comment I was just going to make. You know, there is this element of desire to want power and to want authority. That's something we must resist. Let me slip back to the union structure. I've heard people from time to time make comments. You know, a conference's director may say, for example, referring to his or her counterpart at the union level as his or her boss.
Yeah.
On other occasions, they use the term my functional superior. So if I use an example, let's say the personal ministry director, I know the union's personal ministry director is listening right now, but this is just an example. So the personal ministry director at the conference may say, my boss at the union. What exactly is the relationship that should exist between the union's directors and their counterparts at the conference level? I think we made clear already that the conference's director is not reporting to the union's director, but what should be the relationship?
Well, I tell you, the Adventist system is a little bit confusing in this issue. According to policy, a departmental director is not the boss of the pastor, period. He does not have command authority over a pastor, period. But the conference is structured as a managed organization. So you have a boss, and so the person who works in the conference that is not elected, and they're appointed by the president or appointed by executive, or excuse me, AdCom or whatever. Do not have control authority over people in the field. So you have a counterpart at the union, let's say your personal ministry director in the conference, and you have a personal ministry director at the union. That personal ministry director at the union is there for counsel, guidance, training, etc., but is not there to be your boss, period. And so we have a system that, if we honor it, increases the need for open, careful conversation, but it also reduces the possibility that we'll have people arise as controlling and coercive.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did. You did very precisely, in fact. Well, the General Conference is the largest level, and the General Conference in session is the highest decision-making body of the church. Given that we are talking about power and authority, can you comment on decision-making between sessions? So the General Conference in session, that we like to refer to it as the highest authority, but what happens between sessions?
Well, between sessions is and this is going to sound strange, but I believe is a matter of wisdom. If you use the period between sessions to act on something like women's ordination, and the executive committee has the authority to make decisions between sessions, and it's fine. But any wise leader would not tackle that kind of a subject and make a decision on it between sessions, because you'll be held accountable for what you did, and you better know exactly where the people of your conference stand on this before you make a decision like that. So I think the voice of wisdom should say, make sure that you have had proper conversation with your people. Make sure you plowed that field and know where it's rough and where it's not. Mm-hmm. and making decisions between sessions. One of the things that concerns me is a pattern that has emerged in the last probably 20 years or 30 years. There's a tendency for leaders in key positions to hold their resignation for retirement until it can happen just after conference session, so that the decision is made by the executive committee. And so often our executive committees do a lot of rubber stamping for these kinds of things, but we end up effectively removing the authority of the people to make the decisions necessary to fill the vacancies in the conference office. And if we sidestep that privilege by retiring at a point in time that doesn't allow the session to do that work, then we are I think abusing the system.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and maybe the pandemic created a scenario to see how this functions, because we had an interesting situation where general conference session, or even in some fields, union sessions, and even local conference sessions were delayed because of the pandemic. So for example, we are now having general conference session this year when it was constitutionally due 2 years before. Individuals who were to be retired, let's say somebody was to be retired. We had the secretary of the general conference who was retired, and we had the treasurer who retired. They were replaced by the executive committee as a function of the executive committee. That replacement, was that to fill the, how does that work now? Because we're now going to a general conference session. At this session, are we re-electing the secretary and the treasurer who were appointed by the committee recently?
Well, my counsel would be hold on to your hat because there's going to be rough water. It concerns me greatly. Will we ever again bring our people together in session, or will we use this pandemic as a point in time where we change over, and you don't have direct because it's not always what happens in the meeting room, it's what happens in the hallway. That general conference session that really is important, where you have conversations and you develop wisdom. But something happened in the last 3 years that is similar to this. The title of the people who work at the General Conference would be Elder Ted N.C. Wilson, President of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventist. That is his formal title. But about the end of 2018, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe the year after, and it first came out in Adventist World, it started using a different title. And the title that has been embraced now by the General Conference is Ted N.C. Wilson, President of the World Church of Seventh-day Adventists. Now, I'm not saying this to just be open in saying this. He's aware of my concerns. Okay. But if you look at those two, remember that the scope of your authority is established very often by your title. So which of these titles seems to bear the most authority? Ted, President Wilson, President of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, President of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, or President of the World Church of Seventh-day Adventists?
Well, certainly the World Church.
Yeah. And so what we have done, and I have not been able to get an answer about when it was authorized or who authorized it, but we basically have expanded by title. We have expanded the authority of the General Conference, not just the institution of the General Conference, but the World Church of Seventh-day Adventists. And it amazes me how quiet we are about this, where we allow the trappings of power and authority to be changed in favor of an autocratic model, whether it was intended to be that way or not. I'm not passing judgment on Elder Wilson on this, but this is a dangerous reality. And so we have to keep our ears to the rail, listening to what's going on, because the natural tendency of the human heart is to move toward consolidation of power for self.
Interesting. Now, we do have a few questions from our viewers, and I want to get these in before we finish. This first question takes us back to the authority of the pastor in the local church. Somebody is asking, can an ordained elder perform a baptism if the pastor is late? So
if the pastor is what?
Is late. I am assuming the pastor is supposed to be at the baptism, but he's delayed.
I would say, let us sing, shall we gather at the river 2 or 3 times. and that's a point of wisdom. An ordained elder can baptize. It can baptize with the permission of the pastor. If the pastor is not going to be present, it requires the permission of the president of the conference. Okay. Now, I don't think that we use our elders enough in baptism. I think that we ought to use them more than we do. But again, in some people's mind, that diminishes the authority of the ordained clergy. But I believe that we are reluctant sometimes to share those moments, precious moments of baptizing someone, have them look into your eyes, and you see the Spirit working in their heart, and that embrace that takes place. That would, in my opinion, that would encourage our elders to be much more involved in soul winning.
So I see a good example here of authority and power, so that if the elder takes it upon himself to do the baptism, he is not authorized to do so, then he's functioning outside of the scope of his authority. But if it is prearranged, then he has the right authority. Yes.
If that's the case, the simple thing to do would be to call him on the cell phone. I mean, cell phones have made it possible for us to communicate almost ubiquitously. And get someone other than the elder to call the pastor and say, we're close to being dismissed and you're not here, and would like to have your permission for Elder Brown to perform the baptism. And a wise pastor who is in that situation would and should give permission for that baptism to take place. Now, that doesn't completely pass the letter of the law, because it's supposed to also be covered by the General Conference president. But my guess is you wouldn't get any hassle from the president if the president understood the circumstances of that baptism.
Here is another question. Does a pastor have the authority to invite his own guests to a meeting in which he's asked to mediate?
I'll say the last part of that again.
Does the pastor have the authority to invite his own guests to a meeting which he's asked to mediate? My sense is that
to mediate a conflict.
Yes, that's my sense. I am not sure if that's what the person meant, but that's my understanding.
Well, most of the time when that sort of thing happens, it results in the pastor losing authority, because it reveals the fact that he has a preference in terms of the decision that's to be made, and may even seem to be stacking the deck or bringing in, because anybody who's not a member on the books of that specific Adventist church should not be in the meeting, period. When you have a meeting dealing with conflict and the possibility of discipline, the church can actually be sued for having someone in the building or in the meeting that's not supposed to be there, or discipline is threatened on a person who's not a member. That happened in Southern California a few years ago, and the person threatened was a lawyer, and he ended up walking away with almost $250,000 of church money. It was a settlement of that suit. So we have to be very careful that authorized people only in those kinds of meetings.
I don't want to ask you one final question here. Our time is going, but from time to time, we do have disappointments at sessions, at conference sessions, local conference sessions, perhaps even union. You know, you will sometimes hear people saying, you know, they treated me unfairly because I should have been returned to office. The election process appoints individuals to serve for a period of time.
Yes.
How do we guard against the feelings of disappointment and the feeling of ownership to the office?
I'm gonna answer the part about contesting and not being reelected just for a moment. We had a pastor in the northeastern part of the United States some years ago who had been conference president for a better part of 15 years, quite a while. And so he was not reelected. And on his own, he went to the microphone on the platform, and he was so affected by it, his body was shaking. And that the tremors from his body transferred through the neck of the microphone and into the microphone. So you have this very dramatic sound of boom, 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 boom. And the president simply leans forward and said, "This is my conference." Well, is it? Was it ever his conference?
Not at all.
So as we lose balance in terms of authority and power, as we lose balance, we can embarrass ourselves something awful. Because we serve at the will of the people. And if the people say we should step down, we should maybe have our boxes packed ahead of time to demonstrate that we actually are willing to step away.
Mm-hmm.
But the office does not belong to us. The office is simply is an expression of the trust of the people that we would responsibly fill that office. Was there another part of the question?
I think that's about it. You know, in terms of feeling a sense of disappointment when you're not re-elected, so to speak. I don't even want to use the term re-elected because your appointment in the first instance was for a particular period of time.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that we ought to understand in terms of authority and constituency session. Be very careful as an executive, a leader. Be very careful about your assumptions on the day of the constituency. Because the truth is, when you come to the constituency session, you come without authority. You follow me? Mm-hmm. Your authority has already been separated from you, and so you serve the process, but you do not stand at the pulpit as the president of the conference. You stand as a member of the conference and an ordained minister. And I think that how you conduct yourself in the context of that moment will say a lot about whether or not you have a character that is fit for higher office.
Very true, very true. Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson, for sharing with us. It was an interesting session. I am grateful that you were able to give up your time for these past 2 weeks. And we wish you God's blessings in your retirement. And we look forward to another time when we can get some more of your counsel.
Well, I'm honored even just to be asked. So God bless you, and know that I have enjoyed many trips into the Caribbean that I wish were still happening.
By God's grace.
Yes, yes.
Now, I want to say to our viewers that next week we have a very interesting discussion coming up. You know, There are two issues that have arisen recently, at least in the Caribbean context, and perhaps the second one in North America likewise, the issue of marital rape and the issue of abortion. So next week, we are going to begin a discussion on these issues. We're going to begin a discussion next week on the issue of marital rape. We want to invite you to join us for that very interesting discussion. In some of our countries, there has been a law enacted. In others, there is discussion in the legislature concerning whether they're going to make marital rape a civil offense or not. We're going to be having a discussion on this next week. So we invite you to join us at 3 p.m. same time. May God bless you until then.